Smoke billowed skyward. The wizard had been away for too long, and now it was too late. He crested the snow-covered hill and gazed upon his home. He remembered splendid Sarfall as he always knew it. He saw through his mind's eye a sprawling citadel, the finest Nordic masonry, magic in its own right. The streets bustled with the clamour of 1,000 conversations. Soldiers stood sentinel upon their towers, the winter sun reflecting off of plate and mail, alive with iridescent sorceries, most of which he himself had enchanted. Beneath it all, like the roots of a tree, the city stretched underground, for it was built to endure the elements and house an ever-expanding population of Nordic settlers. A sudden sharp wind blew smoke into his eyes, and when the wizard blinked, he saw that the layer of snow over Sarfall was in fact ash. The Nordic stonework was charred black. The streets were silent, populated by the scorched shells of its former inhabitants. The towers had crumbled and caved in, and not a soul stirred within the subterranean city, which now served as a tomb. The wizard walked the frozen streets, gritted with ash and bone. He descended into the depths of the citadel. The door to his home was ajar. Its internal side had been defaced by deep grooves, carved frantically by the innocent people interred within. The wizard stepped through the threshold, and though they were only skeletons, he knew he was looking at his wife and child. The wizard removed his robe and wrapped the blackened bones of his family within its folds. He would later learn the truth of the event that became known in the histories as the Night of Tears. But the wizard did not shed a tear that day. Instead, he swore to shed the blood of those responsible. Amid the ashes, in the smouldering ruins of his home, he swore a terrible oath of vengeance. And from that comes the name the legends give him, Ahzidal, the embittered destroyer. To know his story, we must know the story of the Nordic migration to Skyrim, and the rising tensions between man and mer that led to the infamous Night of Tears. The Nordic longships clattered through stormy swells. Not even an army of waves could prevent their return. It was a battlefield, and the children of the sky left foam and froth in their wake. They forged a path over the breakers, ascending each one to its apex, until finally the clouds parted and Kind's tears were evaporated by radiant beams of astral light. Like pillars of shimmering sorcery sent straight from Sovngarde, the sun guided the longships to the shore. The black surface of the sea turned cerulean, and from the distant horizon the throat of the world jutted toward Ephirius. It was to be a glorious homecoming, for the Nords had ever been lost in the frigid foreign tundras of Elder Wood at Mora. The ships glided across the shallows and made landings at Hasaric Head, Skyrim's northernmost promontory. Upon arrival, the Nords noticed that pale-skinned elves roamed the untamed wilderness, and so they named the land Mareth, which loosely translates to Elven in Nordic. According to the histories, the Snow Elves and Northmen coexisted harmoniously for a time. After all, there was plenty of territory to share. Alas, these amicable relations would not last. The Nords flourished, summoning more of their kin from the north to build the first of many great Nordic cities. The city was named Sarfall, and it was a sign of intent carven from stone, that the Nords were here to stay. It was during the construction of this sprawling citadel that the once peaceful Falmer grew hostile. Some sources, like the Pocket Guide, suggest that the elves saw that the vital young race would soon surpass their stagnant culture. But I find this hard to believe. The Nords called Skyrim Mareth for a reason. This time in history was also called the Marethic Era for a reason. The elves of Tamriel were superior to the races of man and beast in those days. Their cultures were more sophisticated, their architecture and technology was far more advanced than the rudimentary settlements of the Needs, and it's evident all across the continent. The Aelids and Durrani subdued the local populaces and established themselves as the preeminent culture in their respective regions. The Dwemer, even to this day, remain unparalleled in terms of innovation and engineering, and even the Falmer, who have largely been forgotten about, for reasons we'll soon discuss, clearly had an enlightened culture and built great monuments to their gods. So, for the Snow Elves to suddenly become belligerent, purely because they saw that the humans were developing their society, seems unreasonable. Something else was going on, and the secret lay within the depths of Sarfall. The text titled The Night of Tears by Draenor Selef states that the Nords found something when they built their city, buried deep in the ground. They attempted to keep it buried, but the elves learned of it and coveted it for themselves. The Nords found the Eye of Magnus, an artifact of immense sanctity. Magnus was an elven god, and the Snow Elves were incensed by the notion that such a hallowed relic would be discovered and possessed by men, the very manifestations of Lorkhan's limitations. Tensions grew, and it would eventually result in tragedy. We cannot prove that the Falmer coveted it, nor can we prove whether the Nords innocently stumbled upon it or whether they intended to tap its power. But the passage of time would suggest the former, as the Eye of Magnus spent thousands of years sealed away beneath the city. Regardless of motivations, there is one important factor that is often overlooked in the histories. We talk about the Nords and Snow Elves as if they are singular entities, but in reality, many of the human settlers at Sarfall had no interest in this divine relic. They would simply have been living their lives. Ahzidal likely had very little to do with the discovery of the Eye, as he was venturing Tamriel in search of knowledge. He had grown up in the frontier city of Sarfall, and the clever men had seen immense potential within him. The text titled Ahzidal's Descent by Harland Greycloak states, as a boy his gift for magic and artifice had been evident to his tutors. As a man, his skill surpassed them all, and finding nothing more to learn among his kin, he left wife and child, and set out to train under the elven masters. Ahzidal, though he would not acquire this title for some time, so I'll call him the Enchanter, had outgrown even the most ambitious of Nordic cities. He had lived alongside heroes of legend like mighty Ysgramor, yet he knew he would better serve his people by expanding his horizons. It would have taken a lot of courage to venture out into Greater Tamriel. The Nords were only just making their presence known on the continent, and had only settled the northernmost tip. Yet the Enchanter traversed the unknown, armed only with his arcane and intellectual prowess. He dwelt among the elves for a few years, and when finally his path led him back to Sarfall, he found only ruins. In his absence, the Night of Tears had occurred, and all he had ever known was turned to ash. The Snow Elves, either out of a desire to acquire the Eye of Magnus, or to prevent the Nords from utilising its ethereal power, had fallen upon Sarfall under the cover of darkness. They slaughtered the unsuspecting humans, leaving no survivors, or so they thought. They put the entire city to the torch, razing it to the ground. Upon his return to the ruins of Sarfall, the Enchanter's sorrow fueled an insatiable hunger for revenge. He had known the Falmer, he had lived among them and shared arcane wisdom with them, and they had butchered and burned his kin. Ahzidal was born, and the Night of Tears was the spark that he would turn into a conflagration, one that would incinerate the elves and decimate all Skyrim. Ahzidal had assumed that no Nord had made it out alive, and so the task was placed squarely on his shoulders. He could not declare war on all the elves of Tamriel, no matter how powerful he was. So, as Greycloak's text states, he bided his time, delving deeper into his art than any before him. From the Dwemer, he learned the 7 natures of metal and how to harmonise them. From the Aelids, the ancient runes and dawn magic even the elves had begun to forget. Among Falmer and Khymer and Ultima he travelled, taking what he could from each, and all the while plotting how he might turn that knowledge against them. The promising young mage, driven by an unyielding thirst for vengeance, was possessed by the need to become all-powerful. Unknowingly, the Snow Elves had created a monster, and had assured their downfall at his hand. Most cultures on Tamriel have their own unique abilities and areas of expertise, and in the Malefic times, the elven races dominated arcane innovation. Ahzidal is one of the few known examples of an individual who tapped the potential of various cultures, especially in these days before formal magical education. The Dwemer were unparalleled when it came to metallurgy, and for an enchanter, the knowledge Ahzidal gained from them was worth its weight in dwarven metal. They could also utilise the unseen power of sound to achieve the seemingly impossible. The Dwemer used tonal magic for everything from mining to medicine, from architecture to psychology, unravelling the mysteries of the mind with their harmonic fluctuations and cerebral reverberations. As for the Ayleids, their citadels may endure the ages, and their reputation for Daedra worship may haunt their legacy. But the Heartland Elves, alongside the Dureni, were at the forefront of many new manifestations of magic, and the progenitors of some groundbreaking sorceries that would eventually be solidified in the School of Alteration. As the text suggests though, the Ayleids truly shone when it came to understanding the significance of the stars. They gazed up at the sky and sought to master its mysteries. We now know that the sun and the stars are the apertures through which magic enters the Mundus, for they are the rents created by Magnus and the Magnagi when they fled the limitations of the mortal realm. They constructed wells from the meteoric metals that fell from the heavens, and used ethereal glass fragments to create their Welkind and Vala stones. These inventions had dazzling potential, but they were only emerging technologies at the time of the Elysian Rebellion, and the eventual downfall of their glorious civilization. Ahzidal is perhaps the oldest living master of these Ayleid secrets. The Heartland Elves were largely struck from the Annals, but not quite so thoroughly as were the Snow Elves. Most surviving information on the Falmer pertains to their war with the Nords, and their betrayal at the hands of the Dwemer. But we can see in the last bastion of Falmer culture, the Forgotten Vale, that the Pale Elves were once an enlightened, advanced society. Calselmo of Markarth has translated some rare Falmer texts from their cryptic, archaic language, and one, titled Touching the Sky, provides some fascinating insights into their culture. Many of the most dedicated Snow Elves once committed themselves to a tireless journey through the Chantry to the Inner Sanctum. They carried with them the paramount desire to become one with their god, Auriel. Though all set out with the determination to prove their worth, few were prepared for the trials that lay ahead, for the path to Auriel was not without its tribulations. The pilgrims struggled not only against the natural elements of the treacherous Vale, but with a myriad of tests upon their faith and loyalty. It is said upon their arrival that many were mere shells of the person they had once been. Some were quite mad from sleeplessness and starved to the point of frailty. By the end of their journey, the marvel that they had the strength yet to carry their vessel and ascend the stairs of the temple was the last true testament of their loyalty. Regardless of each individual's tale, the final words remain eerily similar. It is said that every pilgrim ascended, bathed in light, a look of relief and contentment on their face. Perhaps Ahzidal too made this pilgrimage and used this ascendant knowledge to undermine the very elves who had guided him. From the Chimera, Ahzidal would have learned some crucial skills, quite different from the wisdom of the Anuic elves and their worship of the Aedra. The Chimera had changed, and their culture was centered around the good Daedra, Boethia, Mephala, and Azura. From Mephala especially, Ahzidal would have learned to manipulate and evade his enemies, to use lies and secret murder to further his ambitions. And from the reclusive Telvanni, who believed that the powerful define the standards of virtue, Ahzidal would have become certain that so long as he had the power to avenge the Night of Tears, he would be righteous and virtuous in doing so. Finally, Greycloak suggests that Ahzidal studied with the Ultima, which I believe to be the Psijics, the masters of mysticism, the old ways. The arcane feats of the Psijics border on the divine. According to the text titled On Artaeum, the Psijics are proponents of the Elder Way, taught to them by the original race that inhabited Tamriel. The Elder Way is a philosophy of meditation and study, said to bind the forces of nature to the individual will, and that only scratches the surface of the Psijic Order's secrets. Ahzidal filled his mind with the combined wisdom of every elven race on Tamriel. His mind was therefore the ultimate weapon that could bring about the end of the Malefic era, the era of the elves, and bring about the age of men. So, when songs of the return glided on the northerly gales, Ahzidal was ready. Greycloak writes, finally, word reached him of Ysgramor and his companions, newly arrived from Atmora. For 3 days and nights he rode north, and met them as they made landfall on the icy coast near the ruins of Sarfall, which the elves had fortified against them. He offered the companions his service, and all he had produced in his years of labour. The songs of the return tell the mythic tale of the 500 companions, who blew like a blizzard through the north. Many of the companions' deeds have been so shrouded in legend that it's difficult to distinguish the fact from the fiction. There is a poetic story of Wulfrad's forging, the mighty axe that Ysgramor used to cleave his foes and sunder Skyrim. As he told it, the most legendary of axes was forged in the darkest of nights. It was the Night of Tears. Ysgramor sat staring out across the waters. He rode upon the last ship in his fleet, fleeing Tamriel for the shores of Atmora. From that vantage point, he watched as Sarfall, the first city, burned. A swollen sky poured rain upon the flames, and upon the sea, and the greatest of us all wept bitter tears. So great was the grief of the Harbinger that, instead of salty sorrow, Ysgramor wept tears of purest ebony. His eldest, Ingol, collected the tears in a stein and held his father in a warm embrace. He poured mead down the Harbinger's great throat, wrapped furs around the Harbinger's great shoulders, and slung the Harbinger into a great hammock below decks. Then he set to work, for Ingol, eldest son to the Harbinger of us all, was the greatest smith our people have ever known. There, on the sea, Ingol set to work with his tools. He used lightning to heat the night's tears. The ocean swelled to cool them, and always his hammer blows rang in concert with the rising wind. When Ysgramor awoke the next morning, Ingol presented him with a mighty axe, hewn from the sorrow that had laid him low just the night before. And the Harbinger of us all embraced his son. He cried out in joy, sadness, and rage, and there on the deck of the last ship from Sarfall, Ysgramor named his axe Wulfrad, which means storm's tears in the language of Atmora. This tale lends to the mythic legacy of Ysgramor and his mighty companions, but practically speaking, it was likely Ahzidal who provided the enchantments that made Wulfrad so lethal against the elves. In fact, it's likely that Ahzidal provided the enchantments for all the weapons used by the Nords in this bloody conflict. The 500 companions and Ahzidal wiped out every snow elf they could find, even chasing the remnants of the once prosperous elven race to the Isle of Solstheim. Here the war was ended with the death of the Snow Prince, and the only survivors were those who descended into the subterranean citadels of the Dwemer, where they were summarily poisoned and transformed into the ghastly goblins we see haunting the forgotten halls of the dwarves like vengeful spectres. The embittered destroyer's revenge was complete. It's hard to fathom, at this time in history, a greater living sorcerer than Ahzidal, but he was not content. His craft had become his life, and his hunger for knowledge still gnawed at him, driving him to delve ever deeper. At long last he exhausted the lore of the elves, but it was not enough. He sought the secrets of dragon runes, and won for himself a seat among their high priests. The era of the elves was at an end, and the time had come for men and dragons. Despite the success of the companions, the dragons would exert their supremacy over all. The text titled The Dragon War states, "In the Malefic era, when Ysgramor first set foot on Tamriel, his people brought with them a faith that worshipped animal gods. Foremost among all animals was the dragon. Dragons, being dragons, embraced their role as god-kings over men. After all, were they not fashioned in Akatosh's own image? Were they not superior in every way to the hordes of small, soft creatures that worshipped them? For dragons, power equals truth. They had the power, so therefore it must be truth. Dragons granted small amounts of power to the dragon priests in exchange for absolute obedience. In turn, the dragon priests ruled men as equals to the kings. Ahzidal would not have seen himself as inferior to the dragons, just as he hadn't seen himself as inferior to the elves. But the enchanter knew the value in keeping your enemies close, and harvested all the knowledge he could from them. As a dragon priest, he could learn the dragon tongue, how to do battle by debate, and he could achieve a state of lichdom, using Draga thralls to preserve his life indefinitely. The tyranny of the dragon priests would soon lead to war, and the Nords would once again emerge victorious. But this was trivial to Ahzidal. He was not overthrown along with his contemporaries, nor was he slaughtered like most of the dragons. He instead turned his attention to the one field of study he had not entirely mastered yet. He had exhausted the lore of Tamriel, so he set his sights beyond the confines of the mortal realm, to Oblivion. What exactly Ahzidal procured from the waters of Oblivion is a mystery. When he returned, his powers were enhanced, but he was also driven mad. From there, Ahzidal's name faded from living memory. Only in the most remote corner of civilization, among the Skarl of Solstheim, can we learn the Destroyer's fate. Among the Skarl of Solstheim, it is said he fled to their island, and was sealed in the depths of Kolbjorn Barrow, together with the last of his relics. Ahzidal's pursuit of perfection was all-consuming. He had no allies that outlived their utility. I believe that Ahzidal is arguably the greatest mage who ever lived. There are many rivals for that title, but most of them, like Daive Fear or Right Master Iakesis, lived in societies that encouraged insularity. It's impossible to compare the wisdom of these wizards, especially since some of them have lived for thousands of years. But Ahzidal is unique. If you consider lichdom to be a form of living, or at least undeath, then Ahzidal has endured longer than any of his rivals, even Daive Fear, who is renowned for his 4,000+ year lifespan. And Ahzidal accrued the combined lore and wisdom of so many varied cultures that no mage can compete with the vastness of his knowledge. Fueled by a relentless yearning for revenge, plagued by the misery of losing his wife and child, and everything he ever held dear, a young gifted mage became an embittered destroyer, who warped the wonders of magic into a deadly weapon. Spite forged him into an unrivaled tool of destruction. He burned brighter than Sarfel on the Night of Tears. He watched every one of his enemies die at the hands of the companions he had empowered. He watched an entire elven civilization crumble. And no sooner than he'd had his revenge did Ahzidal turn on his fellow men, exploiting the arrogant dragons until he had absorbed all of their power too. Perhaps in another Kalpa, the Night of Tears may have never occurred. His family may not have been slaughtered, and he may have become a very competent enchanter, a master of his craft until his old age. And then he would have died, and the histories would not have documented this nameless enchanter. But the Night of Tears did happen, and the Snow Elves unknowingly created the architect of their annihilation, the greatest mage who ever lived, the embittered destroyer, Ahzidal. Thank you so much for watching. Beneath the masks, the Dragon Priests have some fascinating stories I'd like to cover on the channel. I'd be interested to hear which Dragon Priest you'd like to see explored next, so let me know in the comments. Links to my socials can be found in the description, along with my Patreon. Please only consider pledging if you can afford it. I'm honestly just happy that so many of you enjoy watching the content as much as I enjoy making it. I appreciate you all. My name is Drew the Daedrologist. You've been watching Drew Mora, and I'll see you in the next one.